Amina had never known the comfort of a gentle hand or the kindness of a voice that spoke her name with love. In the cramped mud-walled house where she lived, she was little more than a shadow moving about with a broom in her hand, sweeping and cleaning from sunrise until the first stars began to appear. Her father had died when she was still small, leaving her in the care of a stepmother who despised her very presence, and two step-siblings who had inherited that cruelty like it was a birthright. To them she was not a daughter or a sister, not even a girl of flesh and blood. She was a tool to command, a back to bend, a body to exhaust. Each morning before the rooster crowed, she was shaken awake, her mat dragged from under her by impatient hands. Sleep clung to her eyes, hunger gnawed at her stomach, but her stepmother's voice was sharper than the ache in her bones. The yard is waiting. Sweep it clean until it shines. Amina would stumble into the yard, barefoot, the broom rough against her palms, and begin the endless ritual. The yard was wide and dry, a stretch of earth that breathed dust with every movement. As her broom scraped across it, clouds of powder rose, settling on her hair, her face, her clothes. No matter how much she swept, the dust returned, swirling as though mocking her effort. It clung to her like her suffering, impossible to be rid of. By midday, her feet were red from the hard ground, small cuts splitting open as she pressed on. When she paused, even for a heartbeat, her stepmother's voice would rise again, accusing, scolding, threatening. Her stepsister lounged in the shade, laughing at her, pointing at the dirt on her face, while her stepbrother sometimes tossed pebbles in her direction just to see her flinch. The cruelty was casual, thoughtless, and yet it stung every time. They lived in comfort while she carried the weight of every chore, grinding grain, fetching water from the far river, cooking meals she was seldom allowed to eat her fill of. But even as she bent under the weight of this endless labor, something in Amina refused to break. Her eyes, dark and deep, held a quiet strength that not even the sharp words of her stepmother could extinguish. She did not cry aloud, though tears sometimes slid silently down her dust-streaked cheeks. She did not curse them, though her heart trembled with pain. She simply swept and swept and swept, each stroke of the broom a stubborn act of survival. Beneath the weight of cruelty, she carried a small ember of resilience, hidden but alive. The villagers often caught glimpses of her thin figure moving in the yard, the broom in her hand, her bare feet dragging. Some pitied her but few spoke. Her suffering was an open secret, but in a world where everyone carried their own burdens, no one dared interfere. So Amina remained alone, caught in a cycle of injustice, her body weary but her spirit unyielding, a forgotten daughter in her own home. From the moment Amina opened her eyes in the morning to the time her body finally collapsed on the thin mat at night, cruelty was the rhythm that guided her days. Her stepmother's hatred was not a passing temper or the occasional sharp word. It was a steady, deliberate storm, a force that shaped every detail of Amina's life. She seemed to draw pleasure from Amina's exhaustion, her sharp tongue like a whip lashing whenever she caught the girl faltering. Lazy, she would hiss if Amina paused to catch her breath. Ungrateful, she would spit if Amina dared to eat a mouthful too quickly. To her stepmother, Amina was a reminder of a husband she had buried with too little love, a child not of her blood, a thorn lodged in her pride. Her step-siblings learned that cruelty early, carrying it like a badge of honor. The stepbrother, older and broad-shouldered, walked past her with his nose in the air, tossing commands at her as though she were a servant bought and paid for. When his friends came to visit, he laughed at her dirt-stained clothes and the cracks in her heels, showing her off as if her misery was entertainment. Her stepsister was more subtle but no less vicious, her words dripping with poison, her laughter sharp and cruel whenever Amina stumbled or dropped something from tired hands. She would sit in the shade with a bowl of fruit and eat slowly, deliberately, while Amina toiled in the sun, letting the juice of ripe mangoes drip onto the ground where Amina could see it, knowing the girl's hunger was a constant companion. Every day was a cycle of endless labor. The morning began with sweeping the vast yard, dust rising into her face, into her hair, into the cracks of her dry lips. The dust was impossible to conquer. It always returned, swirling back to the ground after every sweep as if mocking her effort. From there she was sent to fetch water, walking barefoot to the river with a heavy clay pot balanced on her head. The path was rocky, the ground scorching, and the weight pressed into her neck and shoulders until her bones ached. By the time she returned, her stepmother had already lined up more work, grinding grain with the heavy stone until her arms trembled, cooking meals from which she would eat the scraps left behind, scrubbing clothes until her knuckles were raw. It was not only her body that bore the scars of this life, but her spirit as well. Humiliation was constant. Every mistake, no matter how small, was met with harsh words, and every success was ignored, erased as though she were invisible. She ate quickly in corners, never at the family mat. She was forbidden to sit with them when guests arrived. If she lingered too long in her chores, her stepmother accused her of plotting rebellion. If she worked too quickly, she was accused of trying to show off. Amina lived in a prison where even her silence was twisted into guilt. And yet, through all this she endured. Hunger gnawed at her belly, pain carved lines into her body, but something within her remained untouched. The neighbors noticed her suffering. Of course they did. It was impossible not to. Women passing by would shake their heads as they saw her bending under the weight of water pots twice her size. Men sitting in the marketplace would whisper about the cruelty of her stepmother. Children, less bound by silence, would sometimes ask their mothers why Amina was always working while her stepsister laughed in the shade. But nothing ever changed. Some feared the stepmother's tongue, others shrugged and said it was the way of life, that orphans always bore the harshest lot. Amina knew this silence well. It was another kind of cruelty, softer but still sharp, a reminder that she was alone in her suffering. The yard itself became her constant battlefield. No matter how many times she swept, it refused to surrender. The dust always rose again, clinging to her skin, her hair, her clothes. At times she imagined it was alive, that it rose not just to mock her, but to witness her struggle. It coated her wounds when her feet bled, stung her eyes when tears tried to fall, filled her lungs when she gasped for air. And yet, just as it refused to disappear, so too did she. She was like the dust, trampled, cursed, unwanted, yet always present, always returning no matter how fiercely she was beaten down. In the quiet of her heart, she began to see the dust not only as her torment, but also as her companion, the one thing that, like her, could not be erased. At night, when the house grew still and her stepmother's snores filled the darkness, Amina would lie awake, staring at the thatched roof above her. The day's aches pressed into her bones, but her mind wandered elsewhere. She remembered her real mother's hands braiding her hair when she was small, the softness of her father's voice when he used to call her his jewel. Those memories had faded, worn thin by years of suffering, but they still lived in her heart like fragile embers. She held them tightly because they were proof that she was not born for this cruelty, that she had once been loved, once belonged. And so the days passed, one bleeding into the next, a rhythm of dust, hunger, and exhaustion. To the household, Amina was nothing. To the villagers, she was a silent tragedy. But to herself, she was more than her suffering. She did not yet know how or when or why, but she carried a quiet certainty that one day the weight of cruelty would shift, and that even dust, so ordinary and despised, could rise in ways no one expected. The day began with a heaviness in the air, the kind that pressed against Amina's chest before the sun had even risen. Her stepmother's voice, sharper than usual, ripped her from sleep before dawn. "Up, useless girl. The yard is a disgrace. Sweep it until not a grain of dust remains." There was a venom in her tone that made Amina's stomach knot, as though this morning carried a cruelty deeper than the ones before. She staggered out into the yard with her broom, the earth still cool from the night, the sky pale and waiting for the first blush of the sun. The moment the broom scraped the ground, the work began to consume her. Each sweep raised faint clouds that drifted upward and fell again, clinging to her hair, her lashes, her lips. Her lungs filled with grit, but she kept sweeping. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, spilling its heat into the yard until the earth grew hot enough to sting her bare feet. She could feel the skin on her soles tighten, dry, and then split, but she pressed on. Her stepmother stood at the doorway, arms folded, watching with an expression of grim satisfaction. The stepsister appeared from time to time to laugh at her bent back, while the stepbrother jeered that even a donkey had more worth than her. By noon her body was trembling. Sweat rolled down her face, streaked with dust until her skin looked like cracked clay. Her stomach twisted with hunger, but no food had been offered. She dared not ask. The broom moved slower, dragging instead of sweeping, yet still she forced her arms to rise and fall, until blisters formed on her palms and split like her feet. The blood that trickled from her hands and heels darkened the dry soil, turning the dust into something darker, heavier. When at last her legs buckled beneath her, she collapsed onto her knees. For a moment she leaned forward, clutching the broom as though it were the only thing tethering her to life. The yard tilted and spun before her eyes, and her breath came in jagged gasps. She thought perhaps she would faint, perhaps her body would finally give in and end the torment. But her stepmother's voice cut through her dizziness like a blade. "Don't you dare stop. Sweep, girl, sweep until I can see my reflection in the ground." The words lashed her as surely as a whip, and though every muscle screamed in protest, Amina forced herself back onto her feet. Her blood left small red prints in the dirt as she shuffled forward, broom dragging behind her. It was then that the dust began to change. At first it seemed no different, thin veils rising with each stroke, floating lazily before falling back. But soon the air grew thicker, the dust climbing higher, not dispersing but swirling together as if caught by an invisible hand. The more she swept, the more it rose, not in soft drifts but in coils, twisting like smoke, gathering around her in restless spirals. Amina paused, leaning on her broom, her chest heaving. She blinked against the haze and realized that the air around her was moving even when she stood still. The stepmother barked at her again, but her voice carried a trace of unease. From the corner of her eye, Amina saw the stepsister retreat a few steps from the doorway, brushing dust from her hair. The stepbrother coughed, waving his hands in irritation as though trying to swat away flies. Amina's own body trembled, but as she stood surrounded by the swirling haze, she noticed something strange. It did not sting her eyes as it usually did, nor choke her throat with its dryness. Instead, it seemed to curl gently around her, brushing her skin like a cool hand, carrying with it a strange, almost protective weight. Her blood had seeped into the soil, and she could see it now mixing with the dust, small dark flecks rising into the air along with the pale clouds. Every stroke of the broom seemed to awaken the yard, and every drop of blood gave the dust a strange vitality. She thought of how the dust had always clung to her no matter how fiercely she tried to sweep it away. Perhaps, she wondered through the fog of exhaustion, it had been waiting all this time, waiting for her pain, her sacrifice, her silent cries to give it life. The afternoon stretched on, the sun unrelenting, and yet the dust no longer fell back to earth. It hovered, thicker and darker, filling the yard in a restless storm. The stepmother's shouts grew sharper, but her eyes darted nervously to the air that refused to settle. The stepsister covered her face with her cloth, muttering that she could not breathe. The stepbrother cursed loudly, hacking as though his lungs were full of sand. Still, Amina kept sweeping, though her movements were slow, almost ritualistic, as if she too was no longer in full control. Her broom traced lines across the earth, each stroke pulling more dust into the churning air. As twilight approached, the yard looked like a battlefield of smoke and shadow. The dust whirled higher than the roof of the house, catching the dying sunlight and glowing with a strange, golden haze. Villagers walking past slowed their steps, murmuring in confusion at the sight of the storm that seemed to rise from a single girl's broom. Some crossed themselves and hurried on, whispering of curses. Others lingered at the edges, watching as the family inside coughed and struggled, while Amina, though pale and bleeding, stood calm at the eye of the storm. Her stepmother's voice cracked for the first time, not with anger but with fear. "Enough," she shouted. "Stop at once." But Amina's hands kept moving, guided by something deeper than obedience, something ancient and unseen. Her eyes were heavy with exhaustion, her body weak, yet she felt an odd strength in the dust curling around her, as though it were lifting her upright, carrying her forward. That night, as the last streaks of sunlight vanished, the yard did not settle. The dust remained aloft, humming faintly in the air, a warning, a promise. Amina stood with her broom dangling at her side, her breath shallow, her feet bleeding onto the soil. She was too tired to understand what had begun, too weary to imagine where it would lead. But something had shifted in the world around her. The yard, which had always been her torment, was awake now. The dust, which had always mocked her, had taken her blood into itself. And for the first time, it did not feel like her enemy. It felt like her ally. The dust still clung to Amina long after her broom had fallen from her hand. Her body ached with a heaviness that felt older than her years, as though every cruel word, every lash of hunger, every drop of blood had been pressed into her bones. She sat slumped on the hard earth, her knees drawn weakly to her chest, her bleeding feet leaving small red stains on the ground that the rising dust greedily consumed. With her head bowed, eyes half closed, she whispered, not aloud but inside herself, words that trembled between prayer and despair. "God, do you see me?" The thought was fragile, like a thread stretched too thin. She had prayed before many times, but tonight her plea seemed to burn deeper, her very blood carrying it into the soil. She asked not for wealth, nor for comfort, nor even for freedom. She asked only for justice, for the cruelty that had filled her life to one day meet its answer, for her pain to mean something more than silence. The yard, which had always been an enemy, seemed to hold her prayer. She could feel the dust gather around her lips, carrying the rhythm of her breath, as if the earth itself was listening. Her blood mingled with it, staining the pale grains, and in that mingling she felt a strange connection, as though the ground beneath her was alive and waiting. She thought of her mother then, the woman whose hands once combed her hair with such care that every strand had felt treasured. Her mother had spoken softly even when correcting her, and her laughter had been a melody that filled their small home with warmth. Amina clutched those fading memories tightly now, for they were her only proof that love had once lived in her life. The contrast between past and present was unbearable. Where once there had been kindness, there was now scorn. Where once there had been arms to hold her, there were now hands that shoved her forward, voices that spat commands. She longed for her mother's embrace, for the safety of a voice that spoke her name with tenderness. Instead, she had only the jeers of her stepsister, the mockery of her stepbrother, and the icy hatred of her stepmother, who treated her as though her very existence was a crime. Day after day of pain had become a kind of ritual. Every morning she swept, her body bowing and rising, her hands moving with the steadiness of prayer beads sliding through fingers. Every evening she collapsed, her blood mingling with dust, her breath carrying whispers no one heard. It was as though her suffering had become an offering, unwilling yet constant, a rhythm that pulsed through the house and into the yard. And though Amina did not intend it, her pain was shaping something greater, something unseen. As the sun sank lower, painting the sky with streaks of crimson and gold, Amina could no longer hold herself upright. She sank sideways onto the ground, her face resting against the warm dust. It clung to her skin, filled the cracks in her lips, covered her lashes until they felt heavy. She might have brushed it away, but her arms no longer obeyed her. Exhaustion had stripped her of everything, leaving her fragile and still, like a discarded doll. She let the dust claim her, coating her body as though it wished to hide her from the world that had rejected her. Her eyes fluttered shut, but even in sleep, her lips moved faintly, murmuring prayers too soft for any human ear. The words carried into the air fragile threads of sorrow and hope, borne away by the restless wind. The breeze lifted the dust around her, carrying her whispers outward, scattering them into the night like seeds. Villagers passing by caught the faint echo of a girl's voice, though when they looked into the yard they saw only the swirling haze. They shook their heads, muttering of curses, but hurried on, unwilling to look closer at the girl lying motionless on the ground. The night deepened. The sky above filled with stars and the moon rose, casting a pale glow over the yard. Amina slept, but her suffering did not. It pulsed in the dust, moved in the wind, echoed in the soil that had drunk her blood. Her silent cry had gone farther than she knew, carried on currents unseen, and though her body lay still, her pain traveled outward like a message. The earth had heard her. The wind had carried her grief. Something had shifted, subtle but sure. Amina did not yet know it, but her tears and prayers had awakened more than pity in the heavens. They had stirred the very dust beneath her feet, turning her suffering into a power that would not sleep even as she did. The night settled heavy over the village, a night that should have been quiet, filled only with the chirping of crickets and the far-off hoot of owls. But around the house where Amina slept in the dust, the air was restless. The yard had not stilled as it usually did when the broom was put away. Instead, the soil seemed to breathe, the fine grains rising and falling as though the earth itself had lungs. The dust shifted in waves, gathering in strange, deliberate swirls, curling through the air with an intelligence that made the skin prickle. The villagers passing by were the first to notice. A woman carrying a jug of water stopped in her tracks, staring at the unnatural haze. Her husband, trailing behind, muttered that it was just wind, though he too quickened his pace, unwilling to linger. Two boys on their way back from the fields paused at the fence, wide-eyed, as the dust lifted in twisting ribbons that coiled higher than the trees. One whispered that the house was cursed, that the forgotten daughter had called spirits into the yard. The other shushed him and pulled him away, but not before both had cast wary glances toward Amina's motionless form. Inside the house, the family grew uneasy. The stepmother closed the shutters with a muttered curse, though the dust seeped through the cracks, a thin veil that settled over her dishes and clothes. The stepsister complained that the air felt too heavy to breathe, but her mother snapped at her to be silent, refusing to admit the growing fear gnawing at her chest. Only the stepbrother, bold and cruel, decided to mock what he could not understand. He pushed the door open and strode into the yard where Amina lay curled on the ground. The haze thickened around him, clinging to his skin, his lashes, his teeth. He sneered down at her limp body. "Look at you," he spat, his voice thick with disdain. "Rolling in the dirt like the dog you are. You can sleep in it forever for all I care." He kicked a small cloud of dust toward her, but the gesture backfired. The air seemed to seize upon his movement, lifting into his face in a sudden burst. He coughed violently, stumbling backward, clawing at his throat as though invisible hands had tightened there. The more he tried to shout, the deeper the dust forced itself into his mouth and lungs. His eyes watered, his chest heaved, and for the first time, fear flickered across his features. He turned back toward the house, calling for his mother, but his words were broken by hacking coughs. The stepmother rushed to the doorway, but even she faltered as a gust of dust-laden wind swirled at her feet, carrying the sound of her son's choking like a warning. The stepsister peered from behind her mother, clutching at her sleeve. "What is happening? Why is it only him?" she whispered, her voice trembling. And indeed, the strangeness was undeniable. The dust thickened around the stepbrother, clinging to his mouth and eyes, but where it drifted over Amina's still body, it softened, settling like a blanket rather than an attack. The air bent its fury around the girl who had bled into the soil, sparing her even in her sleep. By now, the villagers had gathered in small clusters along the road, whispering among themselves. Some muttered prayers, crossing themselves against evil. Others watched with grim satisfaction, as though they had always known justice would find this household. The wind circled tighter around the yard, a rising funnel that stirred the trees and rattled the fences. The stepmother tried to shout at them to disperse, but her voice was drowned by the roar of the dust storm that seemed to grow from the ground itself. Amina stirred faintly in her sleep, her lips moving with the ghost of her earlier prayers. Her body was weak, but her spirit seemed to resonate with the storm. The dust responded to her like a loyal creature, curling protectively around her, while lashing outward with violence at those who had tormented her. The stepbrother dropped to his knees, gasping, his fists pounding the earth, but every movement only drew more dust to him, filling his mouth until his words were swallowed whole. The stepmother screamed for Amina to wake, ordering her to stop whatever curse she had called down, but her cries were lost in the chaos. The stepsister began to weep, clutching her mother's arm, begging her to leave the yard, but when they tried, the winds pushed them back, forcing them to remain within the circle of retribution. The storm was no longer a storm of nature. It had intention. It had will. It had chosen its prey. Those watching from beyond the fence saw it clearly. The dust did not strike the innocent. It bypassed the villagers, ignored the chickens scratching nearby, even swirled gently around the children who dared to peek through the gaps in the fence. But within the house, where cruelty had lived, the air was a weapon. Every cruel word spoken to Amina, every harsh blow, every act of mockery seemed to echo now in the violent coughs of her tormentors. The yard was remembering and the yard was punishing. The stepbrother collapsed fully to the ground, choking on a dust that would not relent. His mother tried to drag him inside, but her hands burned as though the dust had turned to fire at her touch. She shrieked and let go, stumbling back with terror in her eyes. The stepsister, pale and trembling, sank to her knees, pleading to the unseen force. "Please forgive us. We didn't mean." Her words were snatched from her throat as the dust coiled into her mouth, silencing her. And still Amina slept. Her chest rose and fell softly, her face peaceful even as chaos reigned around her. To those watching, it seemed as though she commanded the storm in her dreams, that her silent prayers had grown teeth and claws. The villagers whispered among themselves, their voices low. Some called her a witch. Others said she was chosen by the ancestors, her suffering transformed into divine justice. A few bowed their heads, murmuring that the world had finally turned to protect the innocent. The night deepened and the dust continued its dance. It no longer moved like scattered particles of earth but like a living creature, coiling and striking with precision. It spared the weak but punished the cruel. It guarded the broken but smothered the arrogant. Something ancient had awakened in the yard, something born from blood, from pain, from prayer. The household that had thrived on cruelty was now a cage of retribution. The supernatural curse was no longer just a whisper in the air. It had become flesh in the form of dust, breath in the form of wind, judgment in the form of choking darkness. And as the villagers watched with wide, fearful eyes, they knew this was not a passing storm. It was the beginning of a reckoning. The dawn came late to the house that morning. The sun rose as always, but the yard seemed to resist its warmth, cloaked in a haze that hung heavy from the night before. Dust lay on every surface like a shroud, on the steps, on the cooking pots, on the very skin of those who had slept restlessly inside. Amina stirred awake where she had collapsed, her lashes stiff with grit, her hair streaked with fine layers of soil. She sat up slowly, her limbs trembling from exhaustion, her feet still raw and tender. The air around her was dense, yet strangely it did not sting her throat. She breathed as though it were nothing but morning air, though her stepmother and step-siblings coughed harshly behind the walls of the house. The stepmother emerged first, her eyes bloodshot from a night of choking fits, her face lined with fury rather than fear. She would not accept that the yard had turned against her, she would not believe that the dust had chosen sides. To her, there was only one answer to everything that plagued her life: Amina. With a snarl, she pointed at the girl hunched in the yard. "Get up. Take that broom and sweep this place clean. Do you hear me? I don't care if you bleed until your bones show, you will sweep." Amina rose unsteadily, her body weak, her broom lying at her side like a discarded weapon. She picked it up because she knew resistance would only bring more shouting, more blows, and because her spirit, though awake, was still wrapped in obedience. She pressed the broom to the ground and dragged it across the yard. At once the air changed. The dust did not lift in gentle puffs as it had in every other morning of her life. It rose in a sudden surge, thick and heavy, a wall of smoke that curled upward in dark, writhing shapes. The sound of it filled the yard, a dry hiss like countless whispers speaking at once. Amina froze, her broom suspended in the air, but the dust moved without her, swirling and swelling as though her touch had merely called it awake again. From the doorway the stepsister screamed and covered her mouth. Her stepbrother staggered outside, trying to shout insults, but he doubled over almost instantly, hacking so violently that he collapsed to his knees. The dust struck him like a living hand, ramming into his chest, filling his throat until his cries broke into gasps. He clawed at the air, eyes bulging, but the storm only thickened. The stepmother clutched her shawl around her face, but it did nothing. The particles slipped through every weave, filling her nose, stinging her eyes until she stumbled blindly, choking on the very ground she had forced Amina to conquer. Amina stood in the middle of it all, her figure fragile, swaying slightly from weakness. Yet the dust circled her like a shield. It brushed her skin but did not sting, swirled around her but never filled her lungs. She breathed freely as though the storm parted for her, recognizing her blood as its own. The villagers soon gathered again, drawn by the cries from the house and the sight of the rising storm. Men stood at the edge of the fence, their faces pale, while women held their children tightly, shielding their mouths with cloth. A few brave souls tried to push closer, calling out to the household, but the storm rose violently at their approach, hurling dust into their faces until they staggered back in terror. It was clear, the fury belonged only to those within the house. From the road, people watched the scene unfold with horror and awe. They saw Amina moving slowly with her broom, untouched, her frail frame illuminated by the shafts of sunlight breaking through the storm. To them she looked like a figure between worlds, both victim and vessel, chosen and cursed. Some whispered that the spirits had risen to avenge her suffering. Others said the dust was no ordinary dust but the breath of her ancestors, choking those who had wronged her. Inside the storm, panic reigned. The stepmother screamed for her children, her voice raw, her arms flailing as though to push back the dust, but every motion only seemed to enrage it further. The stepsister fell to the ground, gasping, her thin fingers scraping lines into the dirt as she struggled for breath. The stepbrother collapsed beside her, his cough so violent that blood streaked his lips. Their mother tried to drag them to safety, but her own body bent with convulsions, her chest rattling like a drum of dry stones. Amina lowered the broom. She no longer swept. She only stood, her eyes wide, her body trembling. Yet the dust moved still, swirling higher, thicker, blotting out the sky above the yard until the sun itself seemed veiled. For a moment she felt a rush of fear. This was no longer her tormentor, no longer just the dust she had fought each day. It was alive, awake, and powerful, and it was moving with a will she had not commanded but had somehow called forth. The villagers stepped back, their whispers rising into cries. "Witchcraft," one man shouted. "No, it is justice," another woman retorted, her eyes fixed on Amina with something like reverence. "The earth has heard her blood," an elder muttered, shaking his head. "This house will not escape what it has sown." The storm raged on, filling every corner of the household, choking its walls, rattling its rafters. The stepmother, coughing and staggering, tried to lift her face to the sky, calling out for mercy, but her voice was drowned in the hiss of the dust. The step-siblings writhed on the ground, their bodies shaking, their mouths opening in soundless cries. The dust spared no corner, no hiding place, no shadow. And yet through it all, Amina stood untouched. She closed her eyes, pressing a hand to her chest, her breath steady as the air circled her. She did not smile, she did not speak, but in her heart she felt the faint echo of her prayers answered. This was not her doing, not entirely. It was the yard's memory, the soil's vengeance, the dust's awakening. Her suffering had been the offering, and now the earth itself had risen in response. The villagers, powerless to intervene, could only watch as the storm consumed the cruel household. Some turned away too afraid to witness. Others remained eyes wide, knowing they were seeing the birth of a story that would be told for generations. By the time the sun reached its highest point, the storm showed no sign of fading. The dust was relentless, a living punishment. The house that had once stood tall now looked small and broken, swallowed by a force it could not escape. And at the center of it all stood Amina, the forgotten daughter, spared by the very dust that was suffocating her tormentors, her thin frame now a symbol of something far greater than herself. The storm did not pass with the dawn. It grew heavier, thicker, as though every sweep of Amina's broom over the years had been stored in the ground, waiting for this one moment to rise. Dust poured through the cracks in the windows, filling the rooms of the house, coating every surface in a suffocating blanket. It settled into the cooking pots, turning the morning porridge into grit. It smothered the firewood, hissing until flames could no longer burn. Clothes folded neatly in baskets became gray lumps. Beds were covered, mats were ruined, and the very water jars carried the taste of earth. Inside, her stepmother staggered from room to room, her screams ragged and desperate. She tried to wave the dust away, swatting with her shawl, clawing at the air with her hands, but each motion only stirred it further, like a beast that grew more ravenous when attacked. "Amina! Stop this!" she shrieked, her voice hoarse, her throat clogged. "You wicked child, you cursed thing, make it stop!" She coughed so violently that her knees buckled, but she crawled forward, dragging herself to the yard where Amina still stood. But Amina did not move. Her broom had long since fallen from her hands, and she only watched with wide, hollow eyes. There was no command she could give that would quell the storm. And even if she could, some part of her no longer wanted to. For years she had swept until her feet bled, bending until her back ached, swallowing the dust they had forced upon her, dust that clung to her hair, her lashes, her very soul. Now it was their turn. The dust was not her enemy. It had risen from her blood, her pain, her silent cries that had soaked into the soil of the yard. It was no longer a burden. It was her ally. Her step-siblings tried to flee, stumbling through the door, but the storm thickened around them. The boy, coughing violently, made it only a few steps before his legs gave way, and he fell hard, his chest heaving as his body writhed on the ground. The girl clutched at her throat, her eyes wide with terror, her voice a choked squeal lost in the roar of the dust. Their figures blurred as the storm wrapped around them, pulling them down into its choking embrace. The stepmother collapsed beside them, still screaming Amina's name, her words broken by hacking coughs. She reached out, her hand trembling, trying to grab hold of Amina's ankle. But the dust thickened like a wall between them. Her fingers clawed at the ground, leaving streaks in the soil before they curled inward, her cries dwindling into silence. From the road the villagers saw it happen. They had gathered again, unable to resist the pull of the spectacle, their faces pale as they watched the dust claim its vengeance. Mothers clutched their children tighter, some weeping, others whispering prayers. Men stood with grim expressions, shifting uneasily, knowing they were witnessing a punishment they could neither stop nor deny. "The house is cursed," one whispered. "No," another corrected, his eyes fixed on Amina standing untouched in the center. "The curse was the cruelty. The dust is only the truth made flesh." Inside the storm, the cries faded one by one until only the hiss of dust remained, filling every corner, every shadow. The once proud household was undone, not by fire, not by sword, but by the very dust they had mocked, the dust they had forced upon a girl they had despised. Amina's body trembled with exhaustion, but her spirit felt strangely steady. She looked down at her feet, raw and torn, streaked with old blood, and for the first time she did not feel shame. Those wounds had called forth something greater than she had ever imagined. She raised her eyes to the storm, watching as it wrapped itself around her tormentors, their bodies sinking into stillness. She felt no triumph, only a quiet, hollow ache. This was not revenge she had plotted. It was justice that had risen, unbidden but unstoppable. The storm lingered, swirling fiercely, then slowly began to settle. Dust sank back into the earth, falling like gray rain, coating the lifeless figures sprawled in the yard. The stepmother lay twisted, her face frozen in horror. The step-siblings were still, their eyes glassy, their lips streaked with blood. Their clothes were gray, their bodies almost unrecognizable beneath the layers of grit. The villagers dared not enter. They watched from afar, some trembling, others murmuring that the spirits of the land had avenged the girl. A few crossed themselves while others bowed their heads in respect. The story was already writing itself in their minds, of the forgotten daughter, of her blood mixing with the soil, of the dust that rose to choke the cruel. And at the center stood Amina, alone but untouched. She felt the last breath of the storm brush against her skin, as though it whispered farewell before sinking back into silence. She lifted her face to the sky, her eyes closed, her lips parting in a trembling sigh. For the first time in years the air she breathed was clean, though heavy with the scent of death. Her tormentors were gone. The house was ruined. And she was left standing. They gathered in clusters at the edge of the yard, afraid to come closer, their eyes darting from the lifeless figures in the dust to the girl who still stood among them. The morning sun had risen high, yet the light could not ease the chill that crept through their bones. The air was heavy with grit, a strange haze that refused to settle, and though no wind stirred the trees, the dust still hovered as if alive. Mothers clutched their children tightly, pulling them behind their skirts, whispering prayers under their breath. Old men leaned on their staffs, shaking their heads, muttering about omens and curses. "She is no ordinary girl," one of them whispered, his voice hoarse. "No mortal survives a storm like that." "A witch," another spat quickly as if naming her would explain everything. "She brought the spirits against her own blood." But others shook their heads. "No. We all saw how they treated her. We all heard her cries. The spirits rose for her. This is justice." The crowd swelled as more villagers arrived, drawn by the strange stillness that hung over the household. The story spread faster than fire, how the stepmother and her children had choked on the very dust they forced upon the girl, how Amina stood untouched while the storm raged. Some came with fear in their eyes, others with awe, but all came with questions. Amina herself did not answer them. She could barely form answers in her own mind. Her legs shook as though they might give way at any moment, her chest ached with every breath, and her head spun with the weight of it all. She stared at her hands, gray with dust, her nails lined with the soil of the yard, as though they had dug into something sacred and pulled it loose. She had not called the storm, not with words, not with spells. Yet it had answered her, her pain, her blood, her unspoken prayers. Was that witchcraft? Was it divine? She did not know. All she knew was that she had asked for mercy, and something had answered with vengeance. From the edge of the crowd, an old woman raised her trembling voice. "This is not witchcraft," she declared, pointing a crooked finger at the house. "This is the earth itself. Dust remembers what is done upon it. Blood remembers too. That girl bled into the soil and the soil rose for her. The spirits have taken their payment." Her words unsettled the crowd further. If the earth could rise for Amina, what might it do for, or against, them? Fear crept into their hearts, a fear not of Amina alone, but of the unseen order they had ignored. For years they had looked away when the stepmother's cruelty bled into the open. They had whispered behind doors but never intervened. Now the earth itself had answered where they had not. And as they argued, as they whispered, the dust began to move again. Not as violently as before, but in restless waves, sweeping across the village paths. It curled into doorways, slipped into pots and bowls, rattled shutters though no wind blew. Chickens scattered, coughing in strange, rasping cries. Goats bleated wildly, pulling against their tethers. Babies cried louder than before, coughing in their mother's arms. The villagers panicked. "It's spreading," one man cried, backing away as though the air itself were poisoned. "The curse is not finished." Others dropped to their knees, pressing their foreheads to the ground, begging forgiveness from the spirits they had ignored. Amina's heart clenched as she saw their terror. She wanted to tell them it wasn't her doing, that she had no power to call the dust beyond her own yard, but the words stuck in her throat. Because deep down she wasn't sure anymore. Had the dust tied itself to her blood, to her pain? Or had she simply awakened something larger than herself, something that now moved according to its own will? She stumbled back toward the ruined house, but the dust parted around her, curling like a path that belonged only to her. To the villagers it was proof enough she was untouched, favored, chosen. To some that was sacred. To others it was terrifying. "She must leave," a man shouted. "If she stays, the whole village will choke." "No," a woman cried. "If she leaves, the spirits may follow her anger. Better she stays and we honor her." The debate grew louder, split between fear and reverence, but no one dared to cross the boundary of the yard. They watched her as though she were no longer human, but something born from the dust itself, a figure both cursed and blessed. And Amina, standing amid the lifeless bodies of those who had broken her spirit, felt the truth pressing down on her. Whether she wished it or not, the storm had marked her. The dust was no longer just dust. It had become a shadow that followed her, a whisper on every breath of wind. The village trembled not only from fear of death, but from the knowledge that their world had shifted. The order they had trusted, the silence of their gods, the weight of their traditions, was broken. The dust had spoken, and it had chosen a forgotten daughter. The storm that had raged with such fury seemed to grow tired at last. The air, once thick with choking grit, began to thin, and the unnatural weight that pressed upon the village slowly lifted. The clouds of dust no longer clawed at throats or filled the sky but sank gently, like weary ashes after a fire. What had seemed a punishment became a hush, an almost holy stillness. The yard, once a place of torment, looked unrecognizable, its surface soft and level as if the storm itself had swept it clean. Amina stood in the center of that silence. Her breath came steady now, no longer the ragged gasps of suffering. She looked down and saw her feet, which had been torn and bloodied from days of cruel labor. The wounds that had bled into the dust were gone, replaced by smooth, unbroken skin. Her body, once heavy with exhaustion, felt strangely light, as though the storm had carried her pain away along with the dust. She swayed on her feet, uncertain whether she had been healed or transformed. All around, the villagers watched her. Their faces were streaked with fear, their eyes wide with awe. Some clutched their children tighter, others pressed their hands together in trembling prayer. One by one, they lowered their gazes, bowing their heads, as though unable to meet the eyes of the girl who had endured torment and summoned a storm. They had once looked at her with pity, with indifference, or with quiet cruelty. Now they looked at her as one set apart, untouchable, marked by powers beyond their understanding. Amina did not speak. She did not need to. The silence itself seemed to crown her, the dust settling like a cloak around her shoulders. She was no longer the forgotten daughter, no longer the servant girl who swept until her feet bled. The yard, once a symbol of her humiliation, had become the place of her ascension. Though her heart ached with memories of suffering, though sorrow still lingered for the mother she had lost and the years stolen from her, there was no more chain upon her. She was free, free from the stepmother's cruelty, free from the mockery of step-siblings, free from the endless sweeping that had ground her spirit into the dirt. And yet, freedom came not as she imagined, but with a price that set her apart forever. The villagers could not embrace her, but neither could they dismiss her. They bowed not in kindness but in fear and reverence. And in that strange mixture of terror and respect, Amina found her place, not as the outcast, not as the forgotten daughter, but as something new, a figure no one dared to scorn, the girl the dust had chosen. Amina did not linger in the house where her childhood had been consumed by cruelty. With her broom abandoned in the corner and her tormentors silenced forever, she walked barefoot across the yard one last time. The earth beneath her no longer cut into her skin. It was smooth, strangely tender, as though it had softened to carry her gently away. Each step felt like a farewell to chains, to hunger, to voices that had stripped her of dignity. She did not look back when she crossed the threshold. Some places were too heavy with pain to deserve a final glance. The villagers watched in hushed silence as she passed. None dared to speak, none dared to reach for her. Their gazes followed her like shadows, filled with equal parts fear and reverence. They knew her life would never again be small, that her name would not fade into dust the way her stepmother had once wished it to. Amina carried no riches, no possessions, but she carried something far greater, freedom. And that freedom had been born of blood, suffering, and a justice that rose from the ground itself. Behind her the yard remained, empty, desolate, and restless. No one dared enter it. No broom touched its soil, no laughter echoed there. The villagers whispered that it was cursed, that at night the dust still stirred, moving like breath across the ground. Some swore they heard faint sweeping sounds when the wind picked up, as if invisible hands still pushed a broom across the earth. Others claimed they saw shapes in the dust, faces choking, voices gasping, the memory of those who had fallen. Children were warned never to play near it, and travelers crossed the village without daring to step upon that soil. The yard had become more than a place. It was a witness, a memory etched into the earth. It remembered Amina's bleeding feet, her silent tears, her whispered prayers. It remembered the cruelty of those who had mocked her suffering, and it remembered the storm that had risen when she could endure no more. And so, though it lay abandoned, it breathed. The dust shifted with each breeze, restless, alive, carrying echoes of justice. The lesson was not lost on the villagers. They knew now that cruelty left stains that even the earth itself might rise to wash away. They saw in Amina's survival a truth that could not be ignored. Innocence cannot be buried forever. Pain, when forced too deep, may awaken forces stronger than flesh or bone. The yard was proof that injustice, no matter how long endured, would one day demand reckoning. And so, though Amina walked forward into her life, free, unbound, no longer a forgotten daughter, the yard she left behind remained a haunting reminder. Dust swirled lightly across it in the twilight, catching the dying sun like golden sparks. It seemed to whisper, to breathe, to remember. Forever it would carry her story, not of defeat but of endurance. Not of silence but of justice. The yard remembered. And so would the world.